Hi, and welcome to week 12 of Research Methods. Today we're going to talk about qualitative analysis. Last week we discussed the analysis of quantitative data, and we're going to talk a little bit about qualitative data. Again, surveys, interviews, things of that nature. It's a little bit of a different way of going about it in terms of analyzing that data, and it can be just as tedious as the quantitative method. But here you're very, very detailed oriented. We'll talk a little bit about some of the ways of doing that. First, I'd like to start with some similarities between qualitative and quantitative data. So the similarities are, one, there's an inference that's made. So there is a kind of almost an educated guess that's based on a hypothesis that is supported by evidence, and that is the case in both of these methods of research. Also, they're both systematic. There's a process to follow, there's a protocol to follow, and that just basically allows you to make sure that your data is valid, that it's reliable, that the information you're collecting is very centered around your hypothesis. So that system being in place and that structure being in place is extremely important. There's comparison too. In both of these, there can be comparison between groups, comparison between various dependent variables. So there's definitely that element to both of them. And also in both of them you want to avoid errors. So whether those be statistical errors, procedural errors, researcher errors, human errors, it doesn't matter. But you want to avoid the errors, because if you don't, the data that you're collecting is kind of loses its validity. And if you're making a lot of mistakes in your research, then someone's going to really question what it is that you did, and obviously question the outcomes. Some of the differences: quantitative is standardized, qualitative is not really as standardized, although there are ways that are, I guess you would call them, standard ways of doing interviews and surveys. Quantitative methods of research are much more structured. There's a lot more flexibility when you're doing qualitative analysis or qualitative research. Quantitative is the data you get at the end of collection, where you don't necessarily, unless you're doing a very long-term study and you have kind of a midpoint, you might do an analysis of your quantitative data just to see if it's moving in the direction that's aligned with your hypothesis or not. But in qualitative data, you tend to look at the data as you go. Quantitative data, you really are looking at the data at the end of the collection, because that's your conclusion, and that's where you're going to see whether your hypothesis bears any fruit. Quantitative data tests hypotheses. That's not necessarily different than qualitative. I think that the qualitative portion, because you're dealing with such variables in human behavior, you're dealing with responses and response time, things like that. You don't tend to deal with that when you're dealing with quantitative information. So testing a hypothesis might be a little bit more concrete, but that's not to say that in qualitative research that you don't have a hypothesis. So I think it more clearly and more concretely tests hypothesis in quantitative research, but it doesn't mean qualitative research is completely void of hypotheses. So don't think that. Qualitative research blends empirical evidence and abstract concepts in the form of, I should say of, not or, in the form of words. So we're using words, using semantics, using language a lot. In quantitative data, it's a little bit more objective. There's not as much of a subjective feel to it. There's no emotion involved. It's basically just numbers in quantitative data. And qualitative data does not assume that real life can be measured by numbers. So again, this is not, like I said, quantitative data is all about numbers. Qualitative data doesn't assume that real life can be measured by numbers. So it's much more about emotion. It's much more about human behavior. So let's take a look at some of the stages of analysis when we're looking at qualitative data. The first thing you want to do is you want to familiarize yourself with the data, and that is kind of where a lot of the detail comes into play. You need to read over the answers to your survey. You need to read over the answers in your interview. You need to pore over them and understand the nuance of those answers and how those answers kind of fit into your hypothesis. You really need to become familiar with the responses in qualitative information. There's also a stage of data reduction where you're throwing out irrelevant information, because obviously during an interview, you know, somebody answers a question, they might go off on a tangent and talk about something that really is not relevant to what your question was. It's part of the interview, obviously, and it's part of what you recorded, but it doesn't necessarily affect in any way the data that you're looking for. So you may want to reduce your data by throwing that information out because it's completely irrelevant. We don't often find that in quantitative information. Quantitative data, we pretty much take everything that we get. Obviously, if there are outliers and there are numbers that just don't make physiologic sense or physical sense, then maybe we question them, but for the most part we're taking everything. You want to organize your data. You want to organize it into first order and second order themes. That's kind of like general themes, and then you want to work your way down and focus a little bit more into more concrete themes, and then get into kind of the raw information, the raw answers that the individual provided. You want to really decide on how you're going to display your data, right? So what, you know, are you going to display it in a graph? Are you going to display it in a line plot? Are you going to display it, you know, what kind of, is it a bar graph? Is it a line graph? What best way is it to display it? And the representation of the data goes a long way to helping the reader understand what it is you're trying to say. And then you want to conclude and you want to kind of verify that your data is true. There are various ways of doing this, and one of the ways I'm not a huge fan of, but it seems that some people do use it. But anyway, the last part is that conclusion, coming to the point where you take the cumulative data and you kind of make sense out of it, and you kind of make a statement out of what it is that you've collected. And then, of course, there's the verification stage, which is understanding that whatever that conclusion is that you just came up with has some truth to it. So now we're going to talk about how to categorize the data, and this is called coding. And this is really where the nitty-gritty comes into play when it comes to qualitative data analysis. This needs to be done correctly. It needs to be done by a very detailed-oriented mind. So the first thing you want to do is you want to tag the data or label it. Now that can be everything from, you know, labeling a particular quote or phrase or word as, you know, a word that relates to, let's say you're studying human performance. You want to tag every one of those phrases or words with a word or an indicator that is going to alert you to the fact that this phrase is specific to either this hypothesis or this thought or this theme or whatever it is, because you have to kind of take your information that you get from your interview and your survey, and you have to place that information in different bins depending upon what the bin is referring to. So you could have a bin that's related to human behavior, you could have a bin that's related to human performance, you could have a bin that's related to specifics of the sport that you studied or interviewed people on or whatever it is, but each one of those phrases or words has to go into a separate bin, and that's the tagging and labeling portion of the coding. You also need to validate the coding. Now, it's kind of interesting. You don't really have a gold standard upon which you're validating the coding, but what you can do is you can go back to the interview and go back to the survey and take a look at, number one, other questions that were similar to the question that you're dealing with, and see whether or not the response was basically the same. You might have some other researchers look at your coding to see whether or not they feel it's valid. So there are various ways of going about it, but validating the phrases, the words, the way you're doing your coding is very important, because that will kind of weigh heavily on how your data comes out, on what your conclusion is. You probably want to also assume mutual exclusivity. You basically want to say that some of the data is very, very different than some of the other data. And when I say data, I'm talking about phrases and words because we're dealing with qualitative information. So unless that word or phrase really speaks to an idea that goes in one particular bin, then you're going to call it mutually exclusive, and you're going to say that these two phrases are completely different and belong in two different bins or two different themes or two different concrete ideas. So you really want to, when you categorize, you need to be able to separate the words, the phrases, whatever it is that you're looking at. You need to be able to separate that into different areas, and it needs to be exhaustive. It needs to be very, it's tedious. It needs to be long and drawn out. You need to go over every single thing. Obviously, your coding bins or your coding themes need to be set up beforehand. What you don't want to do is, and we'll talk about this in a moment, you don't want to basically say, oh, look at that, there's another phrase, all right, let me just make a bin for it. You don't want to do that because then there's a bias there. So you want to set yourself up first, set up your coding structure first, and then once you have your bins or your themes, then you find the phrases and words that fit into those themes. So it does need to be exhaustive. So there are some stages of coding. Careful reading that statements are related to the research question. So this is called open coding, and basically you want to make sure that the statements that you are indicating are related in some way, are relevant to the research question or the hypothesis. So that's kind of an open coding. It's kind of like going through and saying, oh God, that's so irrelevant. Oh, wait a minute, that's relevant. Oh, that's so irrelevant. Oh, that's relevant. So you're splitting it up into almost two bins, relevant and irrelevant bins. The irrelevant are the ones where we talked about data reduction a couple of slides ago. That's the data reduction. You're just kind of getting rid of that stuff because it's not relevant at all to the hypothesis. And then when you have your relevant, you have your relevant bin or your relevant, I'm just going to call it a bin. When you have all of those ideas that are relevant, then you break those down into further areas. But you're separating the relevant from the irrelevant when you do your open coding. Then you have what's called axial coding, and these are statements that relate to any of the coding categories. So again, you have these different areas that you've created, these different pockets or cubbies or bins or whatever you want to call them, and you've done that before. And then what you do is you do your open coding, which basically says irrelevant or relevant, and then out of the relevant stuff, then you break that down into your various pigeonholes. Now you also, at the point you're doing your axial coding, you look for patterns. So these are, you relate certain codes together. So when you're labeling, when you're tagging, you may want to put certain tags together in one particular bin or pigeonhole. You may want to organize the codes sequentially, so as they happen in the order of time. That's a possibility. Or you could possibly identify casual relationships between what was said in an interview or what came back in a survey. So it's important to look for patterns because those patterns are what's going to inform the data as you come to your conclusion. So if you don't find patterns and everything's kind of scattered all over the place, it's not really going to make a lot of sense. So you definitely want to look for those patterns. That's important. And the last thing we'll talk about, and kind of briefly mentioned this before, is you don't want to selectively code your data. So that means that, like anything else, we talked about this in just research methods in general. If you have a selective population, your data is not representative of the general population because you selected out. You basically selected a population to test, and it doesn't matter what it is, but you selected a population to test, and therefore there's a bias there because this population was selected for a particular reason. They're not representative of the general population. In the same way, qualitative data cannot be selectively coded, because what you're then doing is, okay, so now here's a for instance. You now have, 8 places where you're putting your data, right? So, and these bins we talked about. So you have 8 different bins, but then you find, you find a phrase or a word that kind of fits in one bin or maybe another bin, but it really sounds like it goes in the 9th bin that you haven't created yet. You can't just create a bin or a pigeonhole to put data in just because it sounds like it works. And that's really what they call confirmation bias. You're confirming the data to fit into a particular pigeonhole that doesn't exist before you actually collected the data. You can't really do that. It's kind of like cheating, and it shows a bias, right? So so you want to be careful of that. You want to make sure, and that's why when we go back to a couple of slides ago, familiarization of the data is key, because if you're not familiar with it, you're not going to know how to set up your categories. If you are familiar with it, you're going to know how to set up your categories, and chances are all of your data, at least all of your relevant information, is going to be able to fit into one of those categories that you've created. So let's take a look at how this framework actually looks. This is from a book called Research Methods for Sports. And I'm not sure if you can see this. You may be able to, but on the top left of the slide are the raw data themes. And that's the basic unit of analysis, maybe a quote that clearly identifies an experience of a subject. Then you have first order themes. These are clustering, which involves comparing and contrasting each quote and all the other quotes. Maybe unite the quotes with a similar meaning. And separate quotes with different meanings. So these are first order themes. And then you have second order themes in what's called general dimensions. And these are the same contrasting and comparing process described above, identify new higher level order themes. And so higher level themes. The analysis continues until it's not possible to locate further underlying uniformities to create a higher level theme. So you're really drilling down, but this is kind of just a general format of how this works. But let's take a look at how it might work in a real example. So you've done a, and this is right from the book, but you've done a survey on individuals using golf clubs and how much control there is of a particular golf club. So you've done a focus group on golfers, you've given them a club, they've gone out, they've shot 18 holes, and they come back and they take a survey on how easy it is to control the club. So some raw data themes. The first one, the ordinary wood has the ultimate feel. It feels like the golf club you're very much in control of, rather than it's in control of you. If you go down to the fourth one, it says, I feel I have no control over that head at all. I don't know where it is. And then the last one, but I could not control it due to the length and the flex. Sorry, the last one and the second to last one go together. This feels much more difficult to control, but I could not control it due to the length and flex. So now you've got basically 2 bins. You've got the controlled and the uncontrolled. So, and not control group or uncontrolled group, but the people who feel that the head was controllable, people who feel that it was uncontrollable. And then you basically have your general dimension, which has to do with club control. So again, you have the raw data themes, which is exactly what these people said. You have the higher order themes, where you're breaking this down into 2 major categories, one of control, one of non-control. And then you have your general dimension, which is basically what you're asking the golfers about. So that's kind of the way you break this down. And it's the way that you pigeonhole your data, what we were talking about. Now, the confirmation bias might be that you get, here on the left, you get another comment that doesn't necessarily fit in the control and the uncontrol, and then you create a third one. You really shouldn't create a third higher order theme just because you need a new category. You got to figure out how that data fits into one of the themes that you've already made up. Okay, so what are some questions to ask when it comes to analysis of qualitative data? First, you need to look at the human behavior, and you really need to focus on, was that behavior consistent? Maybe you did, 2 focus groups. Maybe you did 4 focus groups, or you did 15 surveys, or you did, 100 interviews. Was the behavior consistent? Maybe looking at consistent behavior in relation to a particular question. Things of that nature. You have to look at the structure. You know, what was the structure of your interview? Was it an open interview? Was it an interview that was led by the interviewee? Was it more of a real structured interview where you were just asking questions and getting responses? What kind of interview was it? What kind of survey was it? We talked all about the different types of surveys and interviews. How about the frequency? How many times did you actually do this? Was it one focus group? Was it a survey that was given out every 6 months? Was it one interview? Was it several interviews? So again, looking at that. What might be the causes of where your data ends up? So if you feel that your data being like the certain phrases and words ends up in certain thematic categories, what might be the causes of that? And again, you're the person who ran the interviews. You're the person who did the surveys. You're the person who did the focus groups. You need to know these inside and out to determine, were there any causes that would kind of result in the data ending up in a certain thematic category. What were the processes? What were the procedures that you actually used? And did those procedures at all influence the type of data that you collected? Were there any consequences to the data that you collected, and then what were the strategies? Now, many of these questions, however, are, I would say, very much in the methodology of your research, not necessarily in the results of your research. So a lot of these have to do with the methods portion of what you did. But these are good questions to ask yourself, and I think they all relate to becoming more familiar with the data. And of course, the more familiar you are with the data, I think the better the result's going to be. So talking a little bit about analysis, we know that with the advent of software, analysis both of quantitative and qualitative information has become a lot easier. It's become almost automated. Just to give you a for instance, although it may not look like it, I'm going to be 50 years old, and I just realized this is going to be on YouTube, so the people who are listening to this in 5 years, I'll actually be 55 at that point. But I'm going to be 50 years old, and the thing is, when learning statistics and learning how to compute statistics, a lot of it we did by hand in graduate school and earlier than that. And now everything's automated. It's basically the click of a button, and that's nice because it's a lot faster. But the human touch, the human element is lost. So one of the things that researchers warn against is using what's called a mechanistic approach. There's various software that allows you to plug in your information, plug in your categories, and your coding is a lot faster, obviously, because it's all computerized. And then once you click the button, you get your answers, and or you get your results. And that's great. I think it's great if you have a very long-term type of study and there's a tremendous amount of data to put in. To do it by hand might increase the amount of error that you would find. However, there is no human element there, and the human touch is lost. So if you have a survey or an interview or something that you're using for the qualitative data analysis that is fairly short in time, then you may be able to do that manually, as opposed to if you have a tremendous amount of information that you have to put into spreadsheets and you have to code, and it's taken you an extremely long time. Plus you have different time points when you're giving these surveys or whatever it is, or focus groups, whatever you're doing. Then you may want to look into more of a mechanistic approach. But you have to be very careful to not fall into the trap of kind of, in a sense, believing everything you see. You need to be careful with, if you're going to use the software, you need to somewhat check that the software is doing it correctly, that there are no errors being made. And don't just take it on its face. The second thing is specific coding beforehand. You need to code your categories, and you need to know what you're looking for before you actually look for it. quantitative data analysis doesn't necessarily have that pitfall because you're just dealing with numbers. So you choose the statistical method you want to use. And although, yeah, you could cheat with statistics for sure, you choose the statistical method and you run your numbers through it. That's it. Here, you've got coding categories that you have to come up with, first order themes that you have to come up with that your data is then going to fall into. And you need to have that done beforehand because you don't want to end up, falling into the trap of the confirmation bias, which again is creating specific coding categories for data that you just basically just saw that moment. So it's important to have that information before. You want to be careful, and also in software, it allows you to create the specific coding beforehand, but also it allows you to create coding afterwards too. You just want to be careful that you don't do that. So I just want to emphasize that. Now, software is great, but it's not human. So in a case where you're looking at an interview and you're looking at a particular response, you may have a software program that identifies the sentence, but it doesn't identify the context in which the sentence was said. That's very important because that can go a long way toward the coding that you're doing. So you need to be careful of that. There's also a learning curve when it comes to software, and that is that it may take a long time to learn how the software works. What are the nuance of the software? How do I run the procedures in the software? Things of that nature. And it may be the same analysis regardless of the method. So in other words, if you're using different methods, you're using a manual method versus a software method, it may be the same analysis that you're using, or you could be using two different computerized methods and end up with the same results. So just be careful. If you're going to use software, it's great if you're doing it, if you need to have it done rapidly, obviously, and somewhat keep it organized. But remember that the human element is lost and errors can still be made. Okay, so trusting the data. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about, and that is that the first one is very, very interesting, and it basically, how do we know that our data is trustworthy? It's important to, once we're familiar with it, we need to understand that at least the data we're collecting is somewhat representative of the people we collected it from, or at least within the themes that we're looking at. Member validation is a very interesting idea, and that is that you take your survey, your focus group results, or your interview responses, and you go back to the participants and you say to them, okay, here's how I coded this. This is kind of what I got from it. Here's the interpretation. Do you agree with it? Now, I don't particularly think that's a great idea. I feel that that is similar to taking quantitative data and saying to somebody, I don't know, your bench press was X when we did the supplement, and then your bench press was Y when we didn't do the supplement. What do you think about this data? I don't particularly think you need to go back to the participants. The point of doing this in qualitative data or qualitative data analysis is because the person who gave the response is not just giving you numbers, but they're giving you emotion and they're giving you real information that is subjective. So they get a chance to say whether or not your interpretation was correct or not. Now, if everything's correct, wonderful. Then you have member validation and your data is true and you can move on to the next step. But what if you have someone who doesn't agree with it? Then what? Does that like poke a hole in everything you've been trying to do? Or then you have to go back and you have to recode and relook? I mean, I don't think that that's the best way of determining whether or not your data is trustworthy. Let's talk about the second way. Negative cases and alternatives. I think this is actually important. So this is not only looking at data that's similar to yours that shows the same thing, but what about the data that shows the negative side of what you're looking at? The data that doesn't agree with what you're looking at, the data that shows an alternative hypothesis to what you're looking at. And this goes for quantitative as well as qualitative, but we're talking about qualitative now. This is really important because this is looking at the other side of the coin. If you don't look at the other side of the coin, or the other side of the issue, then you're only getting the story from one side. And a one-sided story is always a story that could have holes poked in it, and always a story that could be reinterpreted. So it's important to get both sides. Now, if you don't have the ability to get both sides, that's one thing. But if you do, it's always good to look at the negative side of the data you're collecting. Triangulation. This, as opposed to member validation, I think is the best way to go about it. So in other words, now you've done your coding. You've got all of your coding done, and you've placed all of your phrases and words into the different first-order theme categories, and you're pretty satisfied with the way things have come out. Now what you do is you go to a researcher who's done work in this area, and you have them look at it. Or you have a research assistant look at it. Or you have someone who's impartial to the situation look at it. This is triangulation, hitting it from different perspectives, not necessarily the perspective of the participant, but the perspective of people who are known researchers and who are familiar with the type of coding you're doing. Once you get the validation from them, then I think you can trust the data. Let me give you a for instance. I may have mentioned this in a presentation earlier, but when I was doing my dissertation, a lot of what I was doing was looking at EKG data, which is electrocardiograph data, so all different heart rates and heart rhythms. And I would have to choose different heart rhythms, well, not different heart rhythms, but the actual, the highest impact on the scan itself. So exactly when the heart beat, I would have to manually choose that. The computer did most of them, but I'd have to do a lot of manual selection. And then I would go and I would have someone else look at my data to see whether or not that is physiologically possible, to see whether or not the results really made sense. And so we did that a lot. We did that with a lot of the exercise testing we did, because we would come up with the results basically right after the test was done, and then 2 or 3 of us would look at the data to make sure that we agreed with the particular points or the particular particular thresholds that we chose, whatever. So that's really important. I think that's the best way to go about it, is triangulation as opposed to member validation. I don't think the participant really has a role to play in whether or not, in telling you whether or not your data is correct. And if they, like I said, if they say it's not correct, then you're kind of screwed. You may have to start over again. Audit for reliability. So what did we say about reliability? Reliability is basically getting the same data after doing the test over and over again. You're getting the same results, right? So you can audit for reliability. You can look at you could look at similar data that's been collected, or similar questionnaires or surveys that have been conducted, and look and see whether or not your results are similar. Similar interview processes or interview structures, and see whether your results are similar. And it's an audit. It's you're auditing yourself to see whether or not the results are similar if you've done the testing over and over again. Reflexivity is important too, and that's being able to be reflective on your own data. Now, I think this goes for quantitative as well as qualitative, but I feel that when you're looking at data like this, you need to be able to kind of take a break. You need to be able to look at whether or not the data is explaining, or is it relevant, or is it on point with your hypothesis. You really need to be reflective. You need to look back and say, okay, now that I've had a couple of days to look at this, I've done my analysis, let's be reflective and look back and see whether or not this data is telling me, kind of telling me something that's relevant to the hypothesis and in the right context. Okay. As far as written accounts, so when it comes to written accounts, you want the written accounts to be complete. And if they're not complete, then you're going to have a difficult time trusting the data. Obviously, this has a lot to do with human behavior. It has a lot to do with the population that you're studying at the time. And you also want the written account to have verisimilitude. And that is truth. You want the individual to be telling the truth. It's very difficult to determine what that is, especially when you're dealing with things like emotion and you're dealing with qualitative data. But if you have an inkling that an individual is lying, then it's really going to, it's really going to show your data to be very shoddy and untrustworthy. So how do you really determine that? Well, in a written account, it's difficult to do that, especially if it's a survey coming back. Obviously, an interview is different because you can read body language, and there are other ways to determine whether or not an individual is lying or not. But in a written account, it is difficult. So I think one of the ways to do it is that in your survey that you're asking similar questions, but maybe with a different flair, and therefore seeing if you get the same answer, same response. And there are other ways of determining it, and that is also to have other researchers, as we were talking about before, triangulating and having other researchers or other people in the know take a look at the information, and if they've dealt with something similar, they may be able to give you some guidance as to whether or not what has been said in the written account is actually truthful. So I think with the written account, it is difficult. The complete part of it, having it complete is very important, because obviously incomplete data is just not going to be helpful to you. But also, determining whether or not it's true is a little difficult. But I think you can get around it. You can, again, if you ask the same questions over and over again, but in a little bit of a different way with a different twist, you might be able to determine whether or not an individual is not telling the truth. But the key is you need to be able to trust your data. You need to be able to say your data is truthful at the end of the day, because that is what you're presenting. And if you feel it's kind of not as on the up and up as you would like it to be, then you need to really question the data, and you need to question your processes, and maybe go back over your information. So that's really analysis of qualitative data, and the analysis really centers on being very detailed oriented, understanding the structure of what it is that you did, being very organized, not coming up with things just out of the blue to categorize, information, to do that beforehand, to possibly do it manually if it's something that you can do that's short, that's kind of a quick study. But if it's longer, maybe using a computerized program or software program, and also learning how to trust the data and learning how to utilize different resources around you to get to that point, to get to the the point where your data is true. Okay, thanks for listening, and I will be in touch. Take care.